Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Battle for Azeroth class review. I've actually got some great news. This series is sponsored by the great people over at Icy Veins. They're gearing up for Battle for Azeroth, and their first wave of class guides will fully launch with the pre-patch. They've actually recruited 26 new writers for this expansion, so they're really going to be good to go on day one. Of course, I've used Icy Veins for years personally, and their work has been instrumental, both in making this class review series and the Legion one, and I expect the future ones as well. Today, we're going to be tackling the Death Knight, yet another class that received major revamps in Legion, but unlike with the Hunter that we previously covered, Blizzard have went in a bit of a different direction, instead choosing mostly to refine and tweak their proven Legion designs. Okay, time for Frost. This spec was remade in Legion, so Blizzard's BFA changes represent the small tweaks that they think it needs. Now, here's the deal. This version is super close to the Legion one, but it has some improvements, so I'm going to break the normal format, and instead I'm just going to cover the gameplay altering stuff. Alright, key changes. Your main baseline cooldown, Pillar of Frost, went through a bit of a journey on beta, but it's finally arrived in a really cool place. Its cooldown has been reduced by 15 seconds to 45 seconds, and its duration from 20 to 15. Basically, it'll be a bit more common in your rotation. Now, the strength increases down from 20% to 15, but we've got a new mechanic that's awesome. Spending runic power during Pillar of Frost will give you additional strength. This means that you're going to see greater benefit from correct usage, i.e. pulling up your runic power beforehand. Now, its lower cooldown means that it's got a larger place in your rotation, and overall, this is a great way of elevating otherwise simple baseline abilities, and I just love the change. And on the topic of awesome stuff, Death's Advance is a baseline. It gives you 30% movement speed on a 45-second cooldown, and while it's active, you cannot be slowed below 100% move speed. Then it's got a passive effect preventing you from being slowed below 70%, which is great. Then Hungering Rune Weapon. It has been removed from the talent tree because it is the new Empower Rune Weapon. I always love the haste, the cooldown, so I think that's always a plus, and it's had its cooldown reduced from 3 minutes to 2 minutes. So that's a lot of the baseline stuff. Let's get into the talents. Now, the talent tree is broadly similar, but it's been reshuffled with a few good tweaks. So, Icy Talons still has its haste boost that stacks, but it now triggers on runic power spenders, not just on Frost Strike, which means it's going to work with Breath of Sindragosa and Glacial Advance, because Glacial Advance now costs 30 runic power instead of costing a rune. Then we also see other highlights, like Wraithwalk. It's a utility talent in addition to Death's Advance, so if you want a lot more movement, you can have that, which I think DKs will be happy with. Now, I'm going to skip out and cover most of the 57 to 75 tiers. Most of that stuff's just Legion, but we're reshuffled. Now, on the 90 tier, we've got Gathering Storm. It causes you the runes that you spend to increase the damage and duration of Remorseless Winter. Now, this one is great, and I want to call it out because it naturally works well with the new Pillar of Frost, and of course with Breath of Sindragosa. So while that's not a new talent, it's one that fits into the spec a little bit nicer now. Now, also the golden artifact trait, Sindragosa's Fury, it's back, but it's been renamed Frostworm's Fury to be a little bit less confusing with Breath of Sindragosa. It's 3-minute cooldown down from 5, not super interactive with the rest of the spell, but you know what? It's just bloody cool, so I'm glad to have it back. Then Glacial Advance, as I mentioned, it's been swapped over to runic power instead of runes, which goes quite nicely with Icy Talons. Then on the 100 tier, Ice Cap is a cooldown reduction to Pillar of Frost. Now, Pillar of Frost is already in a 45-second cooldown. This makes it even less, so this is great if you just want a nice sort of simple, fast-paced spec. Then Obliteration's effect is the same, giving you guaranteed killing machine procs, but what is different is that it's no longer its own button. Instead, it integrates into Pillar of Frost on that 45-second cooldown, and I kind of love this. It's more just, big smashy, hit the glowing button sort of style gameplay. Then with Breath of Sindragosa, of course, star of the show, and it's back, and it's probably something you're going to be using in BFA. Okay, so now that we've rocketed through a lot of the changes, let's talk about the actual gameplay. In my view, it's essentially a better version of Legion. You still have the dual resource system of runes and runic power, of course. You always want to be generating runes, right? So you want to ensure that you're not capping runes, so you're going to be doing plenty of obliterates. This, of course, generates runic power. You're going to be dumping that into your Frost Strikes. Your auto attack still trigger Killing Machine, which makes your next obliteration a guaranteed crit. Then your obliterates can trigger Rime, which causes your next Howling Blast to be free and deal extra damage. Really, what you you would expect, of course. Now, Howling Blast, it, of course, applies Frost Fever to the target. You'll want to maintain that. Then you've got Remorseless Winter, which pretty much exists as per usual. Really, as you can see, the core of the spec, it's unchanged. But the highlight moments, like Pillar of Frost, they have been strengthened by the BFA changes, and that uplifts the whole spec. So really, that's the core gameplay. The broad talent build that you go with, it's going to depend on your 100 tier pick. So do you want the simple, fast-paced gameplay of Ice Cap? Do you want the smashy fun of Obliteration? Or the more considered, careful, but tremendously satisfying gameplay of lining up the perfect Breath of Sindragosa? Those pillars of the spec, pretty much, they're still there, and you know what? They've all been somewhat enhanced by the small tweaks that Blizzard have made. So to cap it off with my thoughts, this still, at its very basic level, is one of the simpler specs in the game, but it benefits from a far more interesting Pillar of Frost that asks a bit more from the player in terms of planning. Old favourites like Breath of Sindragosa are back, and we see some welcome tweaks to the talents. I really can't overstate how much that change to Pillar of Frost just uplifts every aspect of gameplay, because it is on that 45-second cooldown, and I really think that is the star change here. So overall, for me, Frost gets a pretty big thumbs up. Okay, time for Unholy. So Unholy was one of the most interesting DPS specs in Legion, and what is interesting is, we're just with BFA, the ways in which Blizzard have chosen to carry it forward. They're making it, in some places, a bit less punishing, and also a little bit less RNG dependent. So let's go and take a look at the key changes. So when we talk about the key changes, the first thing to know is the core parts of the rotation are all back, but really what we see is tweaks to how they work, which will result in a spec that feels a little bit more predictable, which broadly does seem to be something the players kind of want. Now, we're still putting Festering Wounds on the target with Festering Strike, and we're still popping those with Scourge Strike, but Festering Strike now generates between 2 and 3 wounds, and the wound cap is 6, down from 8. So basically, it's just a bit more predictable in BFA, because previously it was between 2 and 4 wounds. Then Scourge Strike, it's unchanged from Legion. Alright, so basically the core gameplay of your Festering Wounds and popping them, it is a little bit more predictable in Battle for Azeroth, but the core thing though is all this is still generating runic power. What do you do with that? You dump it into Death Coil. Death Coil is a little bit different. It now costs 40 RP, down from 45, and it reduces the cooldown of Dark Transformation by 1 second. Now, moving on, one of the highlight moments in Legion gameplay with this spec, in my view, is using Apocalypse. You put a bunch of Festering Wounds in the target, use Apocalypse, and boom, it would be awesome. Well, it's now a baseline ability with a 1.5 minute cooldown. It bursts up to 4 wounds to deal a bunch of damage and summon in some friendly ghouls. Like with Frost, we also benefit with from Death's Advance being baseline, and Army of the Dead is down from a 2 and 8 minute cooldown from a 10 minute one, so that might mean that there'll be more fights where you'll actually be able to use it twice, so that actually could be pretty major. So let's hop on over to the baseline gameplay. It's basically a more refined and predictable version of Legion. You're still going to be applying your Virulent Plague on targets with Outbreak. You'll pop, you'll precast Army, you'll do your Dark Transformation, you'll stack up some Festering Wounds with Festering Strike, you'll Apocalypse them down once there's 4 wounds, and then you'll just sink into the usual rotation. Building up wounds with Festering Strike, popping them with Scourge Strike, and burning off the excess RP with Death Coil. Now you're also going to generate free Death Coils from Sudden Doom, which procs from your auto attacks, and then another important passive is Runic Corruption, which causes every runic power that you spend to have a chance to double your rune regen rate for 3 seconds, giving you a little bit of a burst of speed to the spec. It's very satisfying as a baseline spec, but to really see where things go here, I want to hit up the talents. So these have been changed a lot, and there's actually some new talents as well. So on the 56 tier, Infected Claws has been moved down from where it used to be, which was 90, and its chance to apply a wound is down 5%. Then All Will Serve is the same, Clawing Shadows is the same, but it's down from the 58 tier. And basically it's an alternate Scourge Strike that's got a 30-yard range and deals shadow damage. Now on the 57 tier, we see more reshuffling. Bursting Swords is up from the 56 tier, and it's had its damage buff nerfed 50%. Ebon Fear is up from the 56 tier and has been toned down a bit from Legion, and Unholy Blight is a new talent. It is an AoE ability and a 45-second cooldown that spreads a dot to nearby enemies. Then on the 58 tier, it's all about utility. It gives us a D&D that's got a slow, an enhanced ranged death grip, and an asphyxiate. Then hopping over to the 60 tier, we've got a revamped Pestilent Pustules, which now makes it so that bursting a Festering Wound has a 10% chance to proc Runic Corruption, which of course, as we covered, doubles your rune regen for 3 seconds. seconds. So it's a less predictable version of its Legion variant, which just simply gave you a free rune for every 8 Festering Wounds that you burst. Now, moving on to Harbinger of Doom, this causes your Sudden Doom passive to proc 15% more often, and it makes you be able to store 2 charges of that, which makes it a bit more versatile. And then finally, Soul Reaper, which was previously very important in some builds, but kind of hard to use. That's been changed. It used to leave a debuff on the target for 5 seconds, and popping a wound during that window would give you a 7% haste buff that would stack up to 3 times. And using that well was really important to getting value from it, although it wasn't as much of a common pick by the end of Legion, I believe. Now, the new version of this is less powerful. Basically, it just does shadow damage over 8 seconds, and it generates 2 wounds, and then if the target dies during it, you get a 10% haste buff for 8 seconds. Now, 75 is more utility. You've got a buffed up anti-magic shell, an emergency heal with Death Pact, and Wraithwalk. Then on the 90 tier, we've got Pestilence, which gives D&D ticks a chance to apply a Festering Wound. Defile is now down to this tier from 100. It still grows when your enemies stand in it. It still causes your Scourge Strike to cleave, but it no longer increases your mastery. Then we've got Epidemic. This kind of goes mad in your plague. So casting it causes your virulent plagues to flare up on enemies, and that does damage to the plagued enemy as well as the enemies around them. So if you have got like 6 plagued enemies, this is just going to cover your screen in yellow text. Then finally, we've got the 100 tier. Army of the Damned causes your Death Coil and Epidemic, if talented, to reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by 1 second, and Army of the Dead by 5 seconds. That's decently significant from Army, and that's going to allow for more uses of it in a fight, which is pretty important. Then Unholy Frenzy is a new cooldown that increases your haste by 20% and causes auto attacks to infect the target with a Festering Wound. So basically, you'll be slamming your Scourge Strike a lot with this talent. And then Dark Arbiter gameplay is kind of back. It's instead worked into a new talent, which is Summon Gargoyle, which is a 3-minute cooldown. Summons in a gargoyle for 30 seconds, up from the 20 seconds of the Dark Arbiter Valkyr. The difference is that the gargoyle gains 1% increase in damage for every 2 runic power spent, which is down 50% from how it used to be in Legion, where your Dark Arbiter Valkyr would get 1% damage for 1 runic power spent. So it's a little bit weaker, but if that's a style of gameplay that you enjoyed in Legion, you will be able to do it again in BFA. So overall, how's it shaping up for Unholy? Well, I think this spec continues to have an excellent baseline rotation that's all about juggling resources so that you never waste them. There's enough unpredictability with Festering Wounds to keep it interesting, but it is appropriately toned down from Legion. Now, making Apocalypse baseline, I think that is a fantastic move. I think that's a great cooldown for the spec, and the talent tweaks are generally quite welcome. It essentially is a polished up iteration of the Legion version that I think will have a bit of a broader appeal. And really, there's not a tremendous amount to say past that. I think it's got really unique mechanics, which give it a flavor that is pretty differentiated from Frost, and it's nice to have that within a class. And when I compare it to the other melee DPS specs, it stands on its own 2 feet as a unique style of gameplay, which I think is a really good thing, which means that, you know what, the Legion version was pretty cool, the BFA version is a polished up version of that, and yeah, I think that's pretty much a win-win. And next, it is time for the Blood Death Knight. This is another case where Blizzard have kept the core of the spec from Legion, but they've made some tweaks. Now, as with many tanks, these tweaks involve making it fit the broad Battle for Azeroth setup, where tank mitigation seems to be a little bit toned down, more abilities are on the global cooldown, and of course, there are the threat changes, which will have tanks focusing a little bit more on mob management, at least in, say, dungeon scenarios. Now, one interesting thing with Blood is that so much power came from its artifact traits, which of course that's gone in BFA, so it's going to be interesting to see how it survives in a post-artifact world. So let's take a look at the core changes. Basically, your survivability has been kind of tweaked, and it's not really, like, it's back-end stuff, you're not massively going to notice it, but here's kind of what's up. So Bone Shield now grants armor instead of an absorb, Death Strike has been slightly buffed to heal 25% of recent damage taken, and your Mastery Blood Shield has been significantly buffed over Legion, and of course, it causes your Death Strikes to give you an absorb shield. So will you notice this stuff? Not really. you will still maintain a Bone Shield, and you'll still heal back damage taken with your Death Strike. Now, in Legion, your artifact gave Marrow-Rend a chance to generate an extra charge of Bone Shield. That's no longer a mechanic, so your Marrow-Rend is now just a flat 3 charges of your Bone Shield. In terms of other stuff, Gorfiend's Grasp has been nerfed in terms of its range from 20 yards to 15. Dancing Rune Weapon has had its cooldown be reduced from 3 minutes to 2 minutes, and then the Heart Strike Snare is now 20% movement speed decrease, which is down from 50. And then abilities like, of course, Rune Weapon, Death Grip, Tombstone, they're all on the global cooldown now, but you do have a bit of a buff with Death's Advance, which is now baseline for DKs. So really, there's nothing tremendously different here, but there are some tweaks. But let's just talk about the baseline gameplay. There's no big surprises here, it's the same as Legion. You're going to maintain stacks of your Bone Shield as you did in Legion. If you want to disease enemies, you're going to cast Blood Boil. The Crimson Scourge proc is still in, that's going to provide you a free use of Death and Decay that procs off your auto attack, so you'll probably want to use that. Then you want to just balance your other resources. If you're going to cap Runic Power, maybe you burn that off with the Death Strike. If you are risking overcapping runes, then you're either using a Marrow-Rend or a Heart Strike, depending on your Bone Shield situation. So that's really the core, but let's just move into the talents. Broadly, talents have been reshuffled a little bit. The 56 tier has an unchanged Heartbreaker and a nerfed Blood Drinker, plus Rune Strike. So Rune Strike is essentially a redesigned Blood Tap. So it's an attack that generates a rune, and it has a cooldown that is reduced by spending runes, which is pretty similar to Blood Tap, with the difference being that Blood Tap's cooldown was reduced when Bone Shields were consumed. So not a massive change, but it's kind of nice having this effect be an attack, and that probably makes its GCD situation feel a bit more natural. On the second tier, Rapid Decomposition is back, but a little bit weaker. Hemostasis causes your Death Strike to be powered up in both damage and healing for every enemy hit by your Blood Boil, stacking up to 5 times for a total of 40% extra damage and healing, which is pretty nice. It's essentially a reworked version of the Legion Legendary Shoulders as we kept in for BFA, which I think is a pretty awesome move. Then Consumption is back. It was your Legion Artifacts ability, so you'll be pretty familiar with it. Then on the 58 tier, that's our Bone Shield tier, essentially. Now, what's interesting is these effects were previously spread out, so by being in the same tier, we can't choose multiple of them, which is a bit less powerful, but technically it does open up more choices because you're less hemmed into the correct one. So Foul Bulwark causes Bone Shield charges to increase overall health by 1%. Ossuary increases your maximum runic power by 10, and if you've got more than 5 Bone Shield charges, it decreases the cost of Death Strike by 5 RP. Then Tombstone is a defensive cooldown that consumes up to 5 Bone Shield charges, generating 6 runic power and a damage absorb equal to 6% of your max health per charge of Bone Shield for 8 seconds. It's on the GCD, so using it's going to, of course, feel just a little bit slower in Legion. Now in the 60 tier, we've got Will of the Necropolis, which is the same. Anti-Magic Barrier now reduces the cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell by 15 seconds and increases its duration and potency. Then Rune Tap is 1 second longer, but mitigates 10% less damage. Hopping over to the 75 tier, we've got Grip of the Dead, which causes Death and Decay to reduce movement speed of enemies by 90% initially, but then decreasing 10% for every second. Of course, Wraithwalk is back, and in combination with Death's Advance, that gives you 2 movement cooldowns, which is pretty sweet. And then Tightening Grasp is a 30% or 30-second cooldown reduction for Gorfiend's Grasp. And it's kind of odd because what you might notice is that the snare effect that Grip of the Dead gives to Death and Decay, that used to be a part of Tightening Grasp, so it's kind of odd that Blizzard just split these talents up. It seems like they maybe didn't have anything else in that tier, but yeah, that does feel a little bit off. Now in the 90 tier, it starts off with Voraciousness, which causes Death Strike to grant 15% leech for 6 seconds, which doesn't seem that powerful, to be honest. We've got Bloodworms, which has been moved to this tier. It no longer requires crits, and it is quite powerful because auto attacks relatively are a bit more beefy in BFA. Then Mark of Blood is similar to Legion, but a bit weaker. And as for the 100 tier, Purgatory is the same. Red Thirst has been moved here from the 60 tier in Legion, and it's a bit weaker. And Bone Storm is the same in terms of design, but it is 50% more powerful. So what are my overall thoughts? Blood is strange. The gameplay, it's pretty much the same as Legion, just that you have a few talents swapped around and perhaps more even stats because of that mastery change. The main point is that in Legion, there's certain aspects of this spec were extremely powerful. Now, Battle of Azeroth does tone those areas down, which means that while it is fully functional and does stand alongside all the other tanks, it might feel just a little bit weaker in comparison to, where you maybe would have seen it a lot previously, like Mythic Plus. Now, as for the design of Blood, well, I still really do enjoy it, as I did in Legion. So yeah, it's a bit of an odd one. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it, but I think for some players there will be a little bit of sadness there. So time for the Death Knight conclusion. Basically, if you're a DPS player, I think you're going to be really happy. We see great changes to Frost, great changes to Unholy, and what's lovely is that these are two specs that offer completely different flavors of gameplay, and that makes it a versatile class that's going to fit a broad range of players. Then having baseline Death's Advance, that's just great, especially since you can have Wraithwalk on top of that if you really want to get places quick. As for Blood, well, look, realistically, you're all good, right? Some of its niche power has been toned down, that's a bit unfortunate, but the tuning is sort of in line with the rest of the pack, so it's really about what flavor of tank gameplay do you like. The button presses and reactions and all of that of playing Blood, they're essentially the same, but maybe a little bit less powerful. Now that might not feel great, but I can understand Blizzard wanting to make it feel like less like the default choice in some situations. As for me, well, I really enjoy the self-healing design, but I just do find Brewmaster a bit more enjoyable. But with that said, soloing through insane situations with Blood, that always is a boatload of fun. So overall, this class has got 3 great specs. They're all rocking proven designs that have been tweaked and refined in Battle for Azeroth, either to ensure balance with Blood, to remove frustration with Holy, or to add more nuance to the spec with Frost. So on balance, I do think that the Death Knights are coming up pretty damn well in this expansion. Will I play them? Will I main them? That's a really tricky one. I love Windwalker Monk, one of my favorite specs. And for me, DPS does take a prioritization over tank. And Windwalker, it probably is beating out the 2 DPS specs here for me, but not by that much. These are both specs that I really could just continuously play. I find them just really chilled out and enjoyable. So yeah, tricky one for me, but the point is more that this is like a really strong contender and it's pretty damn high up the list. So if you like that Death Knight style, that Death Knight vibe, you've got great specs, which I'll realize that pretty damn well. And yeah, BFA has not broken anything, which is definitely a good thing. So there you go. That is my opinions on the Death Knight for Battle for Azeroth, as well as a compilation of all of the key changes that have been made. A massive thank you to Icy Veins for sponsoring the class review series, and also for just helping out a hell of a lot when it comes to the scripts. It's been great. So massive thank you to them. A massive thank you to you for watching this video. And with all that said, I will see you next time.